Colleagues, I rise today to speak to inquiry number 5 proposed by Senator Harder, calling the attention of the Senate to the role and the mandate of the RCMP, the skills and capabilities required for it to fulfill its role and mandate, and how it should be organized and resourced in the 21st century. I would like to address Senator Harder's specific proposal and then also make some comments about what we are facing today as a country when it comes to policing. First, with respect to Senator Harder's inquiry, its scope is extremely broad if one considers all the components, the issues he raises, which include the RCMP's role, the RCMP's mandate, the skills and capabilities required to fulfill the RCMP's role, the skills and capabilities required to fulfill the RCMP's mandate, how the force should be organized in the 21st century, and how the force should be funded in the 21st century. When one looks at the scope, it touches not only on the federal role of the RCMP, but also its role in 8 provinces and 3 territories. We need to remember that within the domain of federal policing, the RCMP is responsible for all ordinary federal law enforcement, for drug enforcement, for weapons trafficking enforcement, for fugitive apprehension, for the protection of the Governor General and the Prime Minister, as well as other at-risk officials and diplomats, for the policing of properties of the National Capital Region, for counter-espionage, counter-subversion, and counter-terrorism, roles that it carries out in conjunction with CSIS. We then have the separate mandate of RCMP policing in 8 of Canada's 10 provinces, in many municipalities in those provinces, and in Canada's 3 territories. So when we are examining the role of the RCMP and the mandate of the RCMP, in addition to other issues that Senator Harder raises, this constitutes an extremely broad area. All of these areas touch on multiple complexities in policing. They also involve significant machinery of government issues, ones that would likely take years of work to both understand and to address. I understand that it is tempting to come to quick conclusions, one of which is that the RCMP's mandate is too broad. Indeed, Senator Harder has already come to that conclusion. And in this regard, I refer to Senator Harder's remarks in 2021 when he stated, and I quote, "The RCMP's mandate is simply too large and too heavily oriented to a provincial policing role that is no longer appropriate for a critically important federal organization. It's too big to succeed." So for my friend Senator Harder, a conclusion has already been arrived at. I don't know if this is what his intention was, but in reading his words, one might surmise that he has already come to the conclusion that the RCMP must be broken up. That may be what the senator is advocating, but we should be under no illusions at the complexities of doing that, since presumably 8 provinces and 3 territories would have their own views. I know that some provinces, such as Alberta, are considering the option of creating a provincial police force. Such police forces already exist in Ontario, Quebec, and to a more limited extent in Newfoundland and Labrador. But what may work in some provinces may not work in others. Senator Harder was quite correct when he said in his remarks that many Canadians, especially in Western Canada, see the RCMP as a much-loved symbol of a measured and responsible approach to policing in their communities. I can certainly confirm that from personal experience. In rural Manitoba, we have all grown up with the RCMP. which in my experience has always provided exemplary service. I also believe that many provinces themselves would not be in a rush to simply create new provincial police forces out of thin air. There are potentially enormous transition costs associated with creating new provincial police forces. And Canada's debt today is unprecedented. Frankly, I would suggest that today the additional cost burdens associated with potentially creating new provincial police forces are not ones that we would want to assume. In that regard, I think we need to be careful before we rush to the conclusion that in all areas and in all provinces, the RCMP, as Senator Harder put it, is too big to succeed. In my view, that puts the cart before the horse, because there are multiple areas of policing that we first need to fully understand before we arrive at such a definitive conclusion. I think when Canadians consider the broader issue of policing in Canada, there are many issues that they want to see addressed before we jump to the conclusion that it is the RCMP's current organization that is at the root of the problem. I would just like to highlight some of the issues in policing that I believe we should be looking at before we accept such a conclusion. To start with, we have a very serious problem in Canada today when it comes to smuggling of guns destined for criminal organizations. It is quite clear that the smuggled gun problem is really at the root of much of the violence in our urban centres. We also see a growing problem when it comes to the manufacture of 3D printed guns. I recently met with police officers who were very alarmed by the growth of the 3D printed gun problem. And when it comes to gun smuggling, Toronto Deputy Police Chief Myron Demke recently testified in the House of Commons that approximately 86% of crime guns seized were ones that had been smuggled into our country. But we do not hear a lot about that. What we hear from today's government is that they want to target law-abiding sports shooters and collectors, people who have lawfully and responsibly held their firearms for decades. Many engage in wishful thinking that if we go after sports shooters and collectors in Western Canada or rural Ontario and Quebec, some of the gun crime in Toronto and in other urban centres will be reduced. This is an ideological approach to gun control that is ignoring the fact that gun smuggling by organized crime and criminal gangs, as well as 3D gun making, that lies at the root of much of the problem. I think it would have been very useful had Senator Harder's inquiry proposal focused on that type of very specific problem, a problem that actually impacts ordinary Canadians. It is a problem that particularly impacts Canadians who live in many of our urban centres. It also disproportionately impacts Canadians who live in vulnerable communities directly impacted by the scourge of gun and gang crime. When we consider the role of the RCMP in all of this, questions that I think are appropriate include: what resources are available to the RCMP to stop gun smuggling across the Canada-US border? How is the RCMP organized to carry out that task? Would it make sense to devolve such a mandate to a dedicated agency, such as those which exist in the United States when it comes to cross-border smuggling? That sort of investigation is desperately needed, and it would address a real and growing problem. Colleagues, we need to be more aware of the fact that Canadians are being confronted with a major problem related to crime growth in Canada. Too often in this chamber, we are in a bubble where ideology prevails and we are willfully blind to what is going on outside of this building. The CBC recently reported Statistics Canada information which reveals that violent crime in Canada is up some 30% since 2015. the year the current government took office. According to Statistics Canada, there were 2 million crime incidents in Canada in 2021. There were 788 homicides in 2021, 29 more than in 2020. Almost half of the almost 300 firearm homicides in Canada were reported by police as gang-related. My own province of Manitoba had the second highest homicide rate in our country. I would wager that more Canadians are concerned about how to make the RCMP as effective as possible in fighting crime on our streets than they are about how we reorganize the RCMP, because some senators have prematurely concluded that it is too big to succeed. If you ask people in Manitoba, what is their most urgent concern with respect to the RCMP? I doubt very much that they would answer, we urgently need to get rid of the RCMP and set up a provincial police force. What Manitobans want is for the problem of crime to be addressed and for all police services to get the resources that they desperately need. In my recent meeting with Winnipeg police officers, they told me how property crime in Winnipeg has exploded. It has exploded because of the growing drug use and drug dependency. These days, Winnipeg police are not able to respond effectively to property crimes because they are too consumed with the rise in drug-driven violent crime. Some of that is the product of lax laws and revolving door justice system. Now, there are those in this chamber who instinctively reject that, but the evidence is very conclusive. The National Post recently published an investigative report which illustrates how the government's so-called safer supply of drugs is fueling a new opioid crisis. The study interviewed 20 healthcare experts and revealed that a significant portion of the so-called safer supply drugs are being distributed through government-funded programs and then sold at a huge markup on the black market to fund ongoing purchase of fentanyl. Fentanyl, as senators know, has killed more than 35,000 people since 2016. This is a staggering number, colleagues, which rivals most war zones anywhere. And as much as we would like to pretend otherwise, the problem is not going away. In the past number of years, communities across Canada have been flooded with cheap opioids. One doctor is quoted in the study as saying, and I quote, "I meet with people in my office that buy large amounts of it and then ship it off to Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the United States, where it is much more valuable." That drug use on Winnipeg streets has helped fuel the explosion of drug-based crime. There is the additional problem that individuals committing most of the crime often tend to come from the same group of criminals. Michael Winrath, a criminologist at the University of Winnipeg, has analyzed the problems and estimates that while high-risk offenders only constitute 10 to 15% of all offenders, they nevertheless account for 50 to 70% of all the crime. He recently stated, and I quote, "A smaller proportion of repeat offenders are violent and keep committing violent offenses." Knowledge that this is happening is widespread. A CBC story last year reported on this growing problem of prolific offenders in Canada. Prolific offenders are individuals who commit disproportionate percentage of crimes. Such individuals may commit dozens, even hundreds of crimes, and yet they keep getting short sentences as a result of our system. This is a growing problem throughout Canada. Last year, the BC Urban Mayors Caucus, which consists of mayors from 13 municipalities representing more than half of the province's population, wrote a letter to provincial ministers demanding action on the matter of prolific offenders. But provinces can only do so much. What we need are federal laws and a federal government actually willing to address this. We also require courts and judges willing to put the rights of ordinary citizens' communities first when it comes to dealing with high-risk and prolific offenders. Quite frankly, colleagues, the rights of Canadians to be safe in their homes and in their communities are more important than the so-called rights that these offenders have to be on the street. I can tell you that what Manitobans want in the face of this is for our laws to be effective so that the police can forcefully tackle the growth in crime as well as the criminal gangs who are both driving it and exploiting it. A 2019 poll conducted by Probe Research found that the number one community issue for Manitobans was the problem of crime. 39% of Manitobans ranked that problem as their number one community issue. The problem of drugs ranked second at 20%. 4 years later, those concerns by Manitobans have multiplied. None of us is to say that the mandate or organization of the RCMP should not be part of a broader policing discussion. But I believe it is vital that we consider the issue of policing in Canada, that when we consider the issue of policing in Canada, that we start by addressing the real, on-the-ground problems faced by police services in Canada. And one of those real problems facing the RCMP, as with many other police forces, is the shortage of frontline officers on the street. That is certainly a problem in my province of Manitoba. And this is why Manitoba Justice Minister Kelvin Gertson recently held an urgent meeting with the federal minister Mendocino. That meeting request was to address the specific issue of job vacancy rate in the RCMP. Brian Sauvé, president of the National Police Federation, which represents RCMP members, has pointed out recruitment is becoming a very serious challenge for not only the RCMP, but for all police forces. Policing shortages result in unsustainable workloads and exhausted officers. All of this seriously and negatively impacts community safety. And this problem, colleagues, is not unique to Manitoba. A vacancy rate of 20% was recently reported for the RCMP's authorized strength of about 7,100 in British Columbia. Nor is this problem unique to the RCMP. Detachments of the Ontario Provincial Police are also reported as understaffed, and in 2020, more than 1,000 frontline constable positions were vacant, representing 26% of the total frontline constable positions. These are very serious operational shortcomings. Why is this serious problem with policing not being addressed? Why is the Government of Canada instead so ideologically fixated on repealing minimum sentences, even though crime on our streets is growing? Those are issues that the Senate should examine. In terms of RCMP vacancies, cadets for the force are recruited into training cohorts called troops, each of which typically includes 32 cadets. Between 30 and 50 troops should be trained per year. That would allow for the addition of about 800 to 1,200 new officers every year. We have statistics that for the RCMP alone in 2018-19, just as an example, there were more than 8,000 applications to join the force. So in 1 year alone, there were more than 8 times as many applicants as there were training positions. Now, if this is the case, why is recruit output apparently not keeping pace with the number of applications? Why is this such a challenge? Are we training sufficient numbers of officers to even replace those who are leaving? And if not, why not? These are very specific questions that any Senate inquiry should consider. We know that the current waiting list to get into the RCMP is long. Some applicants speak about waiting a year, 2 years, or even 3 years after they apply. Why is this wait so long? What are the main problems with RCMP recruiting? Is it mostly a problem of training capacity at RCMP depot? Why are the bureaucratic hurdles as cumbersome as they appear to be? Has RCMP recruiting drifted too far away from merit and meeting the force's most urgent operational requirements? There appears to be no shortage of applicants from Canada's many demographic communities. We know, for example, that of more than 8,000 applicants in 2018-19, 1,476 identified as visible minority applicants. 357 identified as Indigenous. 1,489 were women. Yet somehow there are real serious personnel shortages within the RCMP. Why is that? Canadians would immediately understand the importance of honestly addressing and answering those questions. Colleagues, we need to remember the immense dangers that our police officers are facing each and every day. When Constable Gregores Perschella, and I'm sorry for probably mispronouncing that badly, of the Ontario Provincial Police was murdered just after Christmas last year. He was the 5th officer murdered in Canada in the fall of 2022. Then we heard of the terrible news concerning the deaths of Constables Travis Jordan and Brett Ryan of the Edmonton Police Service. In April, Sergeant Maureen Bro of Charette du Quebec was murdered when she responded to a call. And now we have the tragic death of yet another Ontario Provincial Police officer, Sergeant Eric Mueller in Bourget, just east of Ottawa. 2 other officers were wounded. This is an unprecedented and terrible situation. My condolences go to the family and friends of Sergeant Eric Mueller, especially as the funeral procession and services was held just earlier today. Please know that our thoughts and prayers are with you, with all of the OPP officers and the entire community of Eastern Ontario as you mourn the loss of a dedicated man, a man of service. In 2021, only 2 officers were murdered in Canada, but in just the past several months, 9 officers have been murdered, and another RCMP officer, Constable Arvinder Singh Dhami, died in a collision while responding to a call. The rise in criminal violence in Canada, the overcrowded conditions that confront our frontline officers, and the increasing attacks on our police officers are the issues that should concern us the most. Now, make no mistake, I applaud Senator Harder for his sentiment and concerns. but in my view, it would be more productive if we focused on the very immediate policing problems that Canadians face. After that, if we need to get questions of organizations, if need be, we can get questions of organization. But let's start by being honest about the real policing challenges that are actually confronting Canadians every day of the week. Thank you, colleagues.